How the Jets feel about a handful of players could shape their offseason strategy. Today, we're talking the players who will determine how the Jets approach the offseason on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, February 6th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making this show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. It's not a crisis line, it's not self-help, it's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. And they have a special offer for my listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. Well, we continue to move closer to the offseason. The official end of the NFL season comes this Sunday. It will be Super Bowl 57 between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. And once we get to that point, then all eyes will turn to what happens in trades, in free agency, and the NFL draft. And the Jets have a number of decisions to make about what they're going to prioritize this offseason. Now, they've already told us that they are going to focus on bringing in a veteran starting quarterback. But what sort of team are they going to build around this quarterback? And what sort of additions are they going to make? Well, it could be determined by how they feel about certain players. The way they prioritize certain positions could be determined by a handful of players who the team could be confident in or may not be so confident in. And today we're going to talk about some of these players. Now, if you look at the wide receiver position right now for the New York Jets, you got Garrett Wilson. You got to love Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson is a star in the making, could very well end up being the Rookie of the Year when the awards are handed out in a few days. After him, though, you got some question marks. You've got Corey Davis, who has actually not a bad contract. You look at the receiver contracts that are given out in the NFL, it's not a bad deal, but he's inconsistent. And not only is he inconsistent, he misses games. And it's not, it's never really a player's fault when he misses games, but he's not a guy you can really count on to play a full 17. He's going to have good games. He's going to have bad games. He's going to have bad drops. He's going to have games where he delivers. But after Corey Davis, I think you have the guy who's the ultimate wild card. And that's Elijah Moore. And Elijah Moore is a wild card in a couple of different ways. First of all, you don't know what he's going to produce. Second of all, you don't know whether he wants to be on the team. This was a disaster season for Elijah Moore. And the thing about it is it kind of came out of nowhere. The ugliness came out of nowhere because he was off to a decent beginning to his season. In fact, in his first 4 games, he was over 40 yards in each game. And those numbers aren't spectacular, but through 4 games, he was on pace for about an 800-yard season, which is a pretty good number 2 receiver for your team. And then it all just fell apart, and of course it culminated in the ugliness after the Green Bay game where he demanded a trade. The Jets deactivated him for the next game in Denver, and he really never worked his way completely back into the lineup. He had a good game against the Bears when Mike White took over, but Moore just kind of disappeared this year. It was like he got off to a pretty good start. He came in with sky-high expectations. I think a lot of people were expecting him to have the type of season Garrett Wilson actually had. He wasn't producing that, but he was still off to a pretty good start, and then he just kind of gave up. And the Jets did not trade him. I thought it was the smart thing to do at the time because, first of all, they really could not replace him. I mean, if you took Elijah Moore out of the lineup, it would have meant more snaps for Denzel Mims or Braxton Berrios, and, say what you will about Elijah Moore, he gives you more than those guys do. But it was a disappointing season all around. And, the Jets, I think, were expecting big things for him last year. After his rookie season where he finished strong, now he finished the season injured, but he finished the season very strong in 2021 and just really did not build on it. And beyond any of the other stuff, I just did not get the sense that he was that explosive. He looked faster his rookie year. He just did not look as fast. He did not look as dangerous with the ball in his hands. I've heard people complain that they did not do enough to get him the ball in space. I guess that's somewhat valid, but I gotta say, it's not like he looked all that dangerous when, they got him on the instances where they threw him screens or they tried to get him the ball on a handoff. He just did not look like the same guy. I think his route running was okay. He probably ran routes at effectively enough that his numbers should have been better if he had a quarterback who could get him the ball. But this was not a difference maker. This was not the guy we were excited about when they drafted him early in the second round in 2021. And this was not the guy who was coming on before, he had all sorts of injury issues near the end of his rookie season. So there are two things you have to ask here. First of all, does Elijah Moore still want to be on this team? Because he obviously left the team at one point during the season and demanded a trade. And you have to ask, does he want to be, is he all in? Is he committed to this team? And if he's not, then I think you have to try and get what you can for him. You have to trade him. I said at the time that the Jets really could not trade him during the season because there was no way to replace him. It was going to be very difficult to find a good starting receiver to replace Moore. So you'd be hurting your team. And the Jets at that point in time really could not afford to take a hit at the wide receiver position. But I did say it as well, once we get to the offseason, it's a different story. Now there's going to be players the Jets will be able to add conceivably if Moore is not all in. So the question is he going to buy in? I think for the Jets, especially since it seems like a lot of his issues were with Mike LaFleur, everybody gets a new start when there's a new coach. And it's not always just the head coach. The new offensive coordinator means everybody gets a fresh start. But does Elijah Moore want to be here? Because if you look at his lack of production after those first 4 games, I think it's fair to conclude that maybe part of the problem is he was just not buying into what the team was doing. And, everybody has bad years. Everybody makes mistakes. You can come back from something like Elijah Moore's done. I mean, I've seen players come back from way worse than what Elijah Moore has done. But he has to prove that he wants to be here. So that's first of all. Second of all, what's he going to produce? Is he going to be the guy who looked so explosive at times as a rookie? Even if you go back to his rookie training camp, there was all this talk about how he was dominating. How he looked phenomenal, how he was going to step right in and make an impact. And he actually did not. He got off to a very slow start his rookie season, and then things started to pick up near the end of October. And unfortunately, it was kind of a sign of things to come because things started to pick up once Zach Wilson left the lineup that rookie year. And he finished the rookie season looking like a guy who could potentially be a number 1 receiver. It was always a bit of a stretch. It wasn't like he was... See, the thing is, we wanted to believe he was Garrett Wilson after that stretch. But he was not. It was one of those things where you could see a path forward where he could become somebody like Garrett Wilson. But he was not producing at the Garrett Wilson level. It was always unclear where he was going to end up. I think, he's at least got the skills where he could be a productive receiver in this league, even if he's never going to be that go-to guy. And by the way, because you actually have the real Garrett Wilson, he doesn't need to be the go-to guy. You need guys who can fill in around Garrett Wilson. But I think that this impacts the Jets in a couple of ways. First of all, if you think Elijah Moore can be a player for you, it makes you less likely to feel like you need to take another big swing at the receiver position in the draft. But second, it also impacts how you deal with Davis, because although Davis's contract is not bad, the Jets are very tight up against the cap. So if you think you have a player in Elijah Moore, it's easier to cut Davis, increase your cushion against the cap. Whereas if you don't believe Elijah Moore is going to be with your team, if you don't believe he's going to produce for your team, or if he's not going to be with you, you might have to keep Davis just as insurance because you don't want to go into the season without credible wide receivers. So how the Jets view Elijah Moore could go a long way towards determining how aggressive they are trying to add another top-flight receiver this offseason. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about another guy the Jets drafted in 2021. We know he's a good player. The question is, where is he going to play? And it's an offensive lineman. It's Elijah Vera Tucker. How the Jets feel about him and his potential position could impact how they address the offensive line, how many resources they throw into it. I'll explain more as we continue on this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is sponsored by BetterHelp Therapy Online. Unfortunately, life does not come with a user manual, so when it's not working for you, it's normal to feel stuck. Therapists are trained to help you figure out the cause of challenging emotions and learn productive coping skills, which makes therapy the closest thing to a guided tour of the complex engine called you. BetterHelp has connected over 3 million people with licensed therapists. It's convenient, secure, and accessible anywhere. 100% online. Therapy has many broad benefits. You learn coping skills, self-empowerment. You learn how to deal with trauma. Everybody deserves to feel their best, and BetterHelp makes it easier to get started. As the world's largest therapy service, they've matched millions of people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. It's all the benefits of in-person therapy, plus it's more convenient, more accessible, and more affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist, and if things are not clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It could not be simpler. There are no waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Get unstuck with BetterHelp. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. This year, the only app you need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And we're very excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they are the #1 sportsbook in America, FanDuel. If you're new to FanDuel, it's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. So go to FanDuel today, FanDuel.com/lockedon, to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. The show's free and available on all platforms. Today we're talking about the players who could shape the Jets' offseason. And the reason they could shape the Jets' offseason is we don't know exactly how the Jets view them. And depending on how the Jets view them, it may impact how they go about addressing certain positions. We talked about Elijah Moore in the first segment. Now I want to talk about another Elijah the Jets drafted in the first round early in 2021, and that's Elijah Vera Tucker. Vera Tucker was drafted to be a guard, and I think most observers, from what I could tell, I mean, even going back to when the Jets drafted him, felt like his best position in the NFL would probably be guard. And that's how it went his first season, which was up and down, I think more good than bad. Year 2 comes along. Jets have some injuries on a tackle. Mekhi Becton goes down. Well, the Jets bring in Dwayne Brown. George Fant goes down. They stick the rookie there. So it's clear the Jets think Elijah Vera Tucker is still best suited at guard. The Jets suffer more injuries. Eventually, they feel like they got to make a move. So Elijah Vera Tucker starts at left tackle against the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 4. And then later on, Brown returns to the lineup, so he kicks over to the right side. And he plays really well. In my view, he played very well at the tackle position. This leads to the question of what happens this offseason. And the tackle position is very much up in the air for the Jets because, first of all, Becton's frankly a guy you cannot count on. And I know that there are some Becton fans out there. And listen, nothing would make me happier than Becton coming back and playing a full 17-game season next year. But the fact of the matter is the man's played one game in the last 2 years. There's a difference between hoping something happens, and I hope it happens, and counting on it to happen. I don't think you can count on it. I think it's one of those things where you bring Becton back, and if he stays healthy and plays well, that's great. You're thrilled with it. I'm not saying get rid of Becton. I don't even think there would be a point in getting rid of Becton because I can't imagine you could get much for him in a trade. But I just don't think it's something you can count on. I think it would be a mistake for the Jets to go into this season counting on Becton to be a starting player for a full 17 games. Dwayne Brown, I mean, listen, I think what he gave you was fine. He's clearly not the player he used to be. He's clearly in decline. The last 2 years have not been as good as the guy. He was a guy who was a Pro Bowl level player for much of his career. He's not there anymore. He still, I think, was effective enough. Not a great run blocker, but a guy who gave the Jets enough, at least stabilized a position that could have gotten really ugly and played through an injury this season. I mean, I respect that because, there was no reason for him to have to come back and play. I don't think he's really adding a lot to his legacy. I guess he just wanted it to play. Beyond that, George Fant's a free agent. It certainly seems like George Fant's leaving. I mean, listen, there doesn't seem like they've really made any progress on a new contract. It doesn't seem like they want to make progress on a new contract and a level that's understandable because Fant is who he is. He's an okay player. He had a good 2021, but not a long-term building block for this team. You got Max Mitchell. He's a wild card, if we're going to be honest. He played this year. He got a lot of praise. I don't think he deserved a lot of praise. I think sometimes a guy goes in there and he's a day 3 pick, and you're just going to praise him no matter what, because if he doesn't look like a catastrophe at all times, you'll say it's a good thing. I'm not convinced Max Mitchell is a player. I'm not convinced he's not. I think he could develop into a good player. I liked the pick, to be honest with you, at the time. In the 4th round, I felt like it was a decent guy to roll the dice on, but it's a 4th round pick. We don't know how he's going to develop. So I don't know who's going to play tackle next year for the Jets. And I don't know if the Jets know. And I think the question is, are they forced to play Vera Tucker at tackle? And part of this will be determined by whether the Jets view Vera Tucker as a guy who can legitimately play tackle, or a guy who was just their best option at the time last year. And so, there are some guys where you can stick them out for like a game, maybe 2, maybe 3, and they won't get exposed. But over the long run, you're going to be in trouble by sticking them out there. Is Vera Tucker one of those guys? Or is he a guy who actually can man the position? And I think that's the question the Jets need to ask themselves, because clearly heading into last season, clearly the 2 years Vera Tucker's been here, they viewed him as more of a guard than a tackle. Because, quite frankly, once Becton went down, if the Jets really viewed Vera Tucker at the time as a tackle, they would have just moved him there. They would not have messed around with signing Dwayne Brown, because the way they signed Dwayne Brown is they used this thing called void years, where they kick all these cap hits to the future. And these are not small cap hits that they push to the future to sign Dwayne Brown. You would never mess around with that if you thought Vera Tucker could play tackle. But of course, sometimes players surprise you. It happens all the time. There are guys all around the league who step in and they do way better than you'd ever thought they do. And sometimes you just kind of stumble onto something. And you wonder, maybe did the Jets stumble onto something in those games, Pittsburgh, Miami, Denver, the games before Vera Tucker got injured. And unfortunately for them, they would probably have had a more definitive answer had Vera Tucker not gotten injured, because there was still about half the season to play, and there was no sign that they were going to get any sort of stability at the tackle position at that point. So it leaves you with kind of a mystery, because you have a small sample size. And it's a good sample size. He played well. What do you have there? I'll say this, it solves one big problem for the Jets if they do think Vera Tucker can play the tackle position, because then you only need to figure out one spot. And between the options you got, you don't have great options with Brown and Becton and Mitchell, but maybe one of them can stick. And if not, you could maybe pick somebody in the 1st round and plug him in, or you can find one veteran. If you only have to deal with one spot, it's a lot easier than dealing with 2 spots, especially at the tackle position. But the question comes down to what the Jets think Vera Tucker is capable of doing. Do they think he's actually capable of holding up for 17 games at tackle, or is he just more of a guy who can go there in a pinch when you're desperate? And that's something we don't know. If they don't think he can play tackle over the long run, then he's going to play guard, and then you got to figure out 2 tackles. And that means that a lot of resources are going to have to be used at the tackle position this offseason. In addition to quarterback, it may not leave a whole lot of room for improving other parts of the team. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a spot of the team that does not need a ton of improvement, but a spot on the team where there is kind of a question mark financially about what the Jets are going to do, and that's defensive end. Jets have a decision to make on Carl Lawson, and there's one player who could make that decision a lot easier if they believe he's ready to step into a full-time role. I'll tell you who that player is as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Blue Nile. Valentine's Day is coming up, which means romance is in the year more than usual. And I do not need to tell all of you lovebirds that you probably had your date planned on the calendar for weeks. Maybe you're making a romantic dinner, putting some romantic music on, or maybe just putting Locked On Jets on in the background. I do not advise that, by the way. But if you found the perfect Valentine's Day gift, if not, whether you're celebrating this day of romance or whether you're ready to pop the question, you can find jewelry as unique as she is with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. At BlueNile.com, you can find the perfect piece of jewelry for life's special moments or create the custom engagement ring of her dreams. Their sample online tools let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as setting style. Blue Nile's bench jewelers will then handcraft that perfect piece to your specifications. Blue Nile provides expert guidance, in-depth educational materials, and unique online tools that place you in control, so you can forget about the usual hassles of the jewelry shopping process and focus on the romance. And right now you can save up to 50% at BlueNile.com. Again, that's BlueNile.com for up to 50% off. BlueNile.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about players who could shape the Jets offseason. These are players already on the roster, and depending on how the Jets feel about these players, it could have a big impact on what the strategy is moving into the 2023 offseason. We've talked mainly about the offensive side of the ball. Now let's move over to the strength of the team, and that's defense. And Jets actually have a pretty big decision to make on the defensive line because there's a player who's good who's probably not worth the money he's making, and that's Carl Lawson. Lawson set to, he's about $15 million. Not much dead money if he's cut this year, so quite a bit of savings if the Jets cut Carl Lawson. And they need it because they don't have a lot of cap space, and they got to bring in a veteran quarterback who's not going to be cheap. So you got to find savings where you can. Lawson's a good player. He's not worth $15-16 million. Can the Jets afford to lose him? Well, it could depend on how Jermaine Johnson develops and what the Jets think of Jermaine Johnson. And quite frankly, I think when you trade up for a guy in the first round, you're doing that because you think this guy's going to be ready to step in year two. And I think that, at the time the Jets made the pick, there probably was at least some degree of strategy there that this guy's going to he's going to play for a year, he'll be a rotational guy year one, then we got to save this money by cutting Lawson year two. And this is the guy who can save us that money. That's sometimes how you make these decisions. The question is whether the Jets can make that happen because, there are good pieces on this defensive line. There's one star, though. It's Quinnen Williams. And after Quinnen Williams, there's lots of good players. But Lawson, I think Lawson, you could argue, is the second best pass rusher there. He's never been a guy who's put up, double-digit sacks, but he puts up good sack numbers. He's a guy you can count on 7 to 8 sacks if he stays healthy, and he's going to just fill up the stat sheet with pressures. And for whatever reason, people don't seem to think that pressures matter in the NFL. Pressures matter a lot. Lawson gets to the quarterback. He beats his man, and he impacts passes. Pressure impacts. One of the funny things is when Zach Wilson struggles, I'll hear people talk about, he was constantly under pressure. How was he supposed to execute? But then something happened. Then Carl Lawson gets a lot of pressure. People say, well, it doesn't matter. He's not getting sacks. I never understand this disconnect because you can see it when your offense is giving up pressure after pressure, even if they aren't giving up sacks. You say this destroyed our quarterback, and you're right. Yet when your defender generates pressure, you complain when he doesn't get sacks. Let's be consistent here. And Carl Lawson generates a lot of pressures. The question is whether Jermaine Johnson can come close to it. I don't know that he necessarily needs to generate the same number of pressures, but can he replace Lawson? Can he be a 3-down player? He played this year. He was a rotational guy, which I think was expected. The Jets like to rotate their guys on the defensive line frequently. I think especially as a rookie, you should break him in. I'm not going to say Johnson was just brought in to sit because he wasn't. You don't pick a defensive lineman in the first round typically if he's not going to play, and especially on a team that likes to rotate guys in and out. You knew he'd see some playing time, and I think he looked pretty good when he was out there. But of course, there's a difference between being a solid rotational guy, being a guy who goes out there for a couple snaps, and when you're a rotational guy, you can pretty much just use up all your energy on one play. You can go all out on a single play. Whereas when you're in for more snaps, you maybe have to channel it a little bit better. You have to conserve your energy a little bit more. So it's different being a full-time player versus being a guy who's goes in for a couple snaps. And of course, Johnson, his best play of the year was when he tracked down Josh Allen in the open field on a bootleg. And there are not many people who can take down, especially big defensive linemen, who can take down Josh Allen one-on-one. And Johnson was able to do that. So you see that this is a guy with potential. Is he going to be an all-pro player? Well, he probably won't be. And I don't think the Jets had expectations of him being an all-pro player. I think it's tough for Jermaine Johnson because you look at the success the other guys who were drafted high for the Jets had. Jets had 4 top 40 picks. One of them was Garrett Wilson, who could be the rookie of the year on offense. Another was Sauce Gardner, who probably will be the defensive rookie of the year on that side of the ball. The other guy is Breece Hall, who, had he not gotten injured, may have won Rookie of the Year over Garrett Wilson. So when you just go in and you play okay, you play pretty well in a rotational role, you kind of fly under the radar. I think Jermaine Johnson had a good rookie year. I think he did more or less what the Jets were hoping from him as a rookie year, but the question is whether he can take over Carl Lawson's role, because the Jets it's really tough to carry Lawson at his current cap number. I think he's a luxury the Jets probably cannot afford at this point in time. He's a nice guy to have, but at that price, it's tough. But it also could come into play if the Jets, do the Jets want to restructure Lawson, or do the Jets want to ask Lawson to take a pay cut? Because if you get that full savings, it goes further. If you can cut Lawson's contract off the cap sheet entirely, it means there's more money to spend elsewhere. But the question is whether Johnson can take over that role as a full-time player, and it's going to depend on what the Jets think of him. We know, I think as of last year when the Jets drafted him, that was the plan. Have they seen enough from him to believe that he's on the type of trajectory that he can take over that role from Lawson? I guess that's something we'll have to wait and see, and it could have a big impact on the Jets' offseason. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.